An unfamiliar voice calls to you.
Return my coin. Find me, and I shall grant you power.
You tell the rest of your party about this voice, but only you seem to hear it. They're concerned you're losing your mind. You try to ignore this voice, but it becomes louder and more persistent. Eventually, you succumb to its demands and convince your party to follow you deep into the Forgotten Woods, where you come upon an old, decrepit hovel. What lies within this abandoned building, you wonder? And could what lies within finally make the voice inside of your mind grow silent? I accidentally came across these aquarium terrain pieces at Walmart, and they actually looked pretty good. So I wanted to enhance them a bit. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these bright colorful plants here so I get a better look at the actual piece itself. I didn't like that it had two doors on both sides, so I took some foam, traced out the back door, and I cut a sample door to close off that space. Using some popsicle sticks, I placed them on my foam door and I scored them just so I'd know where to cut, how long to make the boards. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut them down to size and then glue them onto the door itself. And then once it's all glued, I'm going to trim down the fit, make sure that it sits flush within that doorway frame space, and then glue the entire door into place. I used Khaki glue for this because it dries a lot quicker and it's pretty firm, so it's easy to work with. One thing I didn't show here is I actually thinned out the piece of foam that I used, and I put the boards on both sides of the door so that from the inside you could also see the boards on the back door. Once I got everything glued into place, I primed the model black, and now I'm preparing to cover up on the roof tiles. What I used for this were, again, while at Walmart, I just picked up some really cheap acrylic paints. I picked up an orange and a dark brown and just kind of mixed them together a little bit to give myself a really rich orange brown. I find that this color usually works out pretty well, and I use it pretty consistently on a lot of other wood models. It goes on very orange, but it actually dries pretty dark when it's finally done. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a couple of coats. Once I'm finished doing a couple of coats on the roof, I'm going to jump ahead here and paint the entire body of the model. What I've done is I just used a gray and brown mixture around the stone pieces that I wanted to use the same brown colors on the doors and those window frames. And for the body, I actually used an off-white color mixed with just a touch of khaki to give it that old, worn, plastery look from old houses. As part of the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some washes. Now, I've got some homemade washes that I've used using some black inks and brown inks. It's not as good as something like the Games Workshop washes that you would use, like the Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade. However, it is a lot more efficient, it's cheaper, and I don't have to spend a ton of money filling up these large models using an entire bottle of a $6 wash. So I'm just going to go over and I'm going to wash this entire model. I'm using my black wash on the roof first, and then I'm going to use the brown on the rest of the body. I may have to go over this a few times to get the desired effect. Let it dry. The more washes that you put on this, the darker it's going to look overall, especially when you get to the phase where it's time to dry brush. Now that the washes have dried, I'm going to give this thing a very aggressive dry brushing over the roof. We're going to try to pick out as much of the detail as possible. So as you can kind of see, it's coming off very well across these shingles on the rooftop. What I actually ended up doing after I dry brushed this is I went over one more time with a brown wash to kind of tone down the brightness of the dry brush, let it dry again, and then I went over it a second time with a gray pewter dry brushing to give it really that faded, aged look. This is the only time that I'm using a store-bought wash. I'm using Athonian Camoshade by Games Workshop to give me the weathered, worn, old, mossy look on the rooftop. I'm also going to use this wash pretty aggressively. One or two coverages around the roof should do it. I'll use this on the wooden door frames, on some of the gray stone in the windowsills, the door frames, as well as around the model where the grass would be growing up against the side to give it that aged effect of overgrowth all over the model. Moving on to one of my favorite parts is the basing of the model. I took some chipboard and I just cut out a rough frame and then outlined what the inside looks like because it's got a very thick framing to it. So I didn't really want to fully paint or cover that up. I'm using a dark brown, again, just another cheap acrylic paint that I can use and abuse. You don't have to thin it out too much. You can just kind of glop it on, spread it out. And this is going to be the underlying base for the static grass that I'm going to put down. I wanted to make sure that when I beveled the edges using a blade, it would look more flat no matter where I put it on the table. And then, of course, I painted these edges up as well, just to remain consistent with the piece. So once that dried, I put down some Mod Podge. You can use any kind of PVA you want. And I just spread it all around, covering up all of the mud, because I'm about to lay down my base of static grass. I have a static grass applicator that I like to use for these projects, and it just really helps make the grass stand up. If you don't use one or you haven't ever heard of one, look them up. They're very useful at making static grass stand up easier, giving it a more realistic look. Otherwise, your static grass tends to fall flat and it just doesn't look right. So I'm going to load up my static grass applicator and just kind of lay this down all over the place. Now, I will admit I went over this about 2 times, and I wasn't as pleased with how the PVA was reacting with the grass. So I went over it a 3rd time in the final product with some 3M77, and I laid down one more application just to get some extra long grass on top of the already existing grass, and that worked out really well. Now that my base is done, I'm going to use some of my grass tufts and other terraining materials to just kind of generously fill out the spaces. You don't really want this to look like just a flat piece of grass, so we're going to add some depth to it. I'm using about 3 or 4 different types of tufts and different flowers that I'm going to add in here. And I'm just going to drop them kind of all over the place, not necessarily directly in front of the door. You don't really want to pull people's eye directly to these plants. You want them to kind of naturally look like they've just been growing over time. Next up here, I'm going to take some Woodland Scenics fine leaf foliage, and I'm going to use that as the larger brush. Bushes growing up against the building, climbing up along the side, and giving it really that overgrown appearance. Where I'm placing this one right now, I actually noticed that after I had primed it, there is a little logo for the model and manufacturer, and I did not want that to show up in my piece, of course, so I'm using the fine leaf foliage to essentially hide it. So now that I'm finished up with the fine leaf foliage, I'm going to add a little bit of color using some flower tufts that I have. I'm going to drop down a couple of purple and white flower patches around the model. You want to be careful not to overuse these because it's just not going to look right if you just have this thing just bathed in flowers. So I just kind of selectively dropped them around the piece, nearby the door, places that you would typically see, and then a couple wildly off to the side because you want to make it have that natural appearance. One thing that I noticed was when you look inside the door, you just see some grass, and I didn't want that. So I cut up some popsicle sticks, and I made them look like wood floor that's kind of old and decrepit. I'm going to glue these down, then I'm just going to put over a couple layers of that orangish brown that we used on the roof, and then I'll wash it down again and use the Athonian Camoshade. So when you look through the door, you're going to see an actual flooring inside instead of just some extra grass. And that's it. It's really as easy as that. The overall cost of this piece is a little under $20, assuming that you already had paintbrushes, some basing supplies. The model itself, I think, was about $13, and the paints were about 97 cents each, so it was pretty easy to do. If you guys are looking for a unique piece of terrain to complement the rest of the terrain pieces that you have, you really can't go wrong with these little houses, and I would highly recommend looking for these at pet shops or Walmart, which is where I picked this one up, and doing a little bit of experimenting and see how they come out. Again, it's very cheap to just buy a couple of basic paints and have a little fun with it. I want to thank you guys again so much for taking the time to check out my video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Next week, I'm hoping to bring you guys a video tutorial of how I've done my ice terrain. There's a written tutorial available on miniaturemarauder.com, but I want to do a little video tutorialize and show you guys how quick and easy it really is. So thank you guys again. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and we'll see you next time.